So today we're going to use our understanding of rounding numbers to include capacity and mass. So we recently talked about capacity and mass. Capacity is using liquids to fill a container. We can use milliliters or liters. We use mass is the weight of an object, and we can use the units of grams and kilograms to measure that mass. Now we're going to round each one of our numbers, either capacity or mass of an object, to the nearest 10 and or 100. So let's get started. So at the beginning of the year, we talked about rounding numbers to the closest 10 and or 100. So let's review rounding to the closest 10 to start with. We use a number line to start with. If you notice on this number line, we have 300 and 400 as our beginning and end points at this point. In between, we have our multiples of 10. So we have 310, 320, 330, 340, 350, 360, 370, 380, and 390. In between each one of those tens or groups of 10, we also have 5 as our midway point. So in between 300 and 310 is 305. In between 310 and 320 is 315. 325, 335, 345, and so on. We're going to use our 5 middle point to help us round either down to the lowest 10 or up to the upper 10 when we're rounding to the closest 10. So let's start with the number 382. If you notice, in our tens place, we have an 80. So we want to ask ourselves, what two tens does my number fall between? So if we look at the tens place, we know that we have 380 or 390. Those are the two tens that 382 falls between. Now we're going to use our middle, which is 385, to decide by looking at the ones place. So we see that in the ones place we have a 2. 382 is going to be less than 385. It's 2 away from 380, but it's 8 away from 390. So that tells us that 382 is going to round to 380 when rounding to the closest 10. Now let's take the number 388 and do the same thing. We know that the two tens that 388 will fall between is going to be 380 because we see an 8 in our tens place for 80, and the next 10 would be 390. We notice that since 388 and we see an 8 in our ones place, we know that 8 is greater than the 85. And so since it's greater, we're going to round up to 390. It's 2 away from 90, but 8 away from 380. What about to the nearest 100? Let's take a look. So when we're rounding to the closest 100, we want to do the same thing. So we start with the number line, but this time we're going to use our multiples of 100. In this case, we're going to take the 382 and look at the hundreds place this time. We see that there's a 3 in the hundreds place, so that tells us that we have 300, which is our lower 100, and the next 100, which would be 400. So what two hundreds does my number fall between? 300 and 400. Now we're going to use 350, which is our middle point between each 100, and we're going to decide by looking at our tens place, is the 80 greater than 50 or less than 50? Well, we can see that 382 comes after 350. So since the 80 is after 50, we're going to say it's going to round to 400. But what if, by looking at 382, we see something different in our tens place. We see a 20 this time. So we still know that 328 is between 300 and 400. But if we look at our tens place, 328 is going to be less than 350 on our number line. And so since it's less than 350 on our number line, that tells us that we're going to round down to 300. So let's practice using our understanding of capacity. So we have a number line here, 300 to 400, and it's in multiples of 10. We're going to take the mass of a candle, which is 341 grams, and we're going to use that understanding to round to the closest 10 and the closest 100. So let's see, when we start to round to the closest 10, we look at the two tens that the number falls between. That's our first question. Well, if we notice in the tens place, we have a 40. So that tells us that our number falls between 340 and 350. Those are the two tens that the number is between. Now we look at our ones place to decide, is it less than 345 or greater than 345? Well, if we look at our ones place, 1 is less than 5. So that tells us that we are going to round down to 340. Now let's think about rounding to the nearest 100. We need to think about what two hundreds does my number fall between. So again, using 341, we look at the hundreds place. We see a 300, and we know that the next 100 is 400. So the two hundredths that the number falls between is 300 and 400. Now we use 350, which is in the middle of our hundreds, to decide. Are we going to round down to 300 or are we going to round up to 400? Well, we look at our tens place to decide. We see the 40 and we know that 340 is less than 350. So since it's less than 350, we're going to round down, which is closest to 300. Now it's your turn to practice. So first, you're going to need to number your paper 1 through 5. It'd be a good idea to use your blue notebook that was in your packets. If you'd like to title it, you can title it Rounding Numbers of Capacity and Mass. Second, or then, you're going to write down the name of each object and its capacity or mass. Once you've done this, then you're going to round each object's capacity or mass to the nearest 10 and nearest 100. For example, let's take the candle that we just worked on. The candle, as you see, is 341 grams. When we rounded it to the nearest 10, it rounded to 340. When we rounded it to the nearest 100, the nearest 100 was 300. So let's get started. Number 1, we have a bottle of body wash here, and it is 295 milliliters. So first, we're going to round to the nearest 10. So if we look at our chart and think about what two tens does our 295 number fall between, we could use our chart here to make that decision. First, we need to ask ourselves, what two tens does my number fall between? If you'd like to pause, you can pause at any point to make your choice or do your estimate. Next, we're going to round to the nearest 100. Again, you need to ask yourself, what two hundredths does my number fall between? Again, if you need to pause at any point during this slideshow, you may do so. Number 2, body lotion. This body lotion container has 625 milliliters of lotion in it. First, we're going to round to the closest 10. Remember to ask yourself, using your chart, what two tens does my number fall between? Next, round your number, 625, to the nearest 100. What two hundreds does my number fall between? Use that understanding to round to the closest 100. Remember, 50 is your middle point. Look at your tens place to decide if your tens is less than 50 or greater than 50. Moving on, we have sunscreen. Sunscreen is 141 grams. Rounded to the nearest 10, ask yourself, what two tens does my number fall between? Rounding to the nearest 100, what two hundreds does my number fall between? You should be getting the hang of it by now. Let's go on to our fourth object. Our fourth object, or our fourth container, is hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer contains 236 milliliters. Remember, you're going to round to the nearest 10 first by asking yourself this question, what two tens does my number fall between? And rounding to the nearest 100 and asking yourself, what two hundreds does my number fall between? Remember, you can always use the chart to help you with rounding to the nearest 10 or 100. Please be sure to pause if you need to do so. Number 5, we have a coffee mate container, and that contains 454 grams. Round to the nearest 10. Ask yourself, what two tens does my number fall between? Round to the nearest 100. Ask yourself, what two hundreds does my number fall between? So now that you've had a chance to round each one of these weights or capacity measurements, you will now you're going to type your answers into the MobiMax Messenger app in MobiMax. If you notice here, this is the icon that you'll be looking for in MobiMax. Please remember, when you're typing your answers from today's lesson video into MobiMax Messenger, you're going to number and label your answers. For example, if you were to type this into the MobiMax Messenger, you would type in candle. It was 341 grams. It rounded to 340, which was the nearest 10, and it rounded to 300, which was its nearest 100. I'll be looking forward to seeing your messages in MobiMax Messenger, and we'll let you know and respond to the number that you got correct. I hope you have a great day and can't wait to hear from you in MobiMax Messenger.